Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is going to be episode 16, which will be our fifth installment in our mini-series of the evolution of civilization. It's the Altar of Moloch. So, hi Nima. How you doing this week?
There. Oh, all right. I just got done worshipping a giant owl and burning human sacrifice in effigy. So I'm ready to go, yeah.
Oh. That sounds like a great weekend activity. Where did you do that?
Oh, I do that at my home. I have a little situation room here where I practice different rituals.
Ah. And then, do you have any idea how far back that ritual goes? Or where it might come from?
From what I hear, it goes back to like 3000 BC. So 5,000 years ago.
Aha. Interesting. And like, what area of the world are we talking here?
The Canaanite civilization, which is, I believe, in the area of the Middle East, Syria, etc.
All right. Well, that kind of sounds like the topic of our show. Canaanite civilization.
Wow. What a coincidence.
Ha! Huh. What a darn coincidence. So, as anyone who's been listening to this miniseries knows, we have been reading from Carroll Quigley's The Evolution of Civilization. Carroll Quigley, of course, being more famous for writing the book Tragedy and Hope. But what is in Tragedy and Hope is Quigley's ideas that he describes in this book, Evolution of Civilization, which is essentially an effort to apply the scientific method to historical analysis with the goal of being able to turn history into a practicable and, I guess, predictable subject. So last week, we were talking about Mesopotamian civilization, starting from the Neolithic garden cultures, which descended from the highland zones, which is essentially this long, consistent mountain range that somehow I had never noticed on a map until I read this book, that cuts the Afro-Eurasian landmass in half. So starting from the Alps or the Pyrenees in Europe, going all the way down to the Himalayas, there's flatlands to the north of that in Russia, there's flatlands to the south of that in North Africa and Arabia, and in the middle, you've got this big, long mountain range. And so the Neolithic garden cultures descended from essentially the foothills of these mountain ranges into the alluvial river valleys and started up the first civilization that we know about in mainstream history, which was Mesopotamian civilization, because they brought agriculture and they brought metallurgy to an area that had it where the ground regained its fertility every year. So people could stay in the same place year after year because the floods from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would come and replenish the soil, unlike up in the mountains where they would farm for, I think, roughly 7 years before the soil was depleted and they would move on. We also explored the idea, which is gaining more and more traction in recent years because it's also gaining a lot more evidence in recent years due to new archaeological finds and technology we really didn't have before, which is that Mesopotamia may have actually just been the first civilization after a great cataclysmic event that ended the last ice age roughly 11,600 years ago, where there may have been more civilizations before that, which I find to be a very, very fascinating subject. We mentioned 2 different, or maybe even 3 different Joe Rogan podcasts where Joe Rogan is interviewing some experts in this field. I recommend checking them out. Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, and Robert Schoch were the 3 names that we brought up. But whichever way, whether Mesopotamian civilization was the actual first human civilization, or it was kind of the rebirth of human civilization, the first rebirth of human civilization after a great cataclysmic event. In terms of analyzing civilization through Carroll Quigley's lenses that we're using here, it doesn't really matter. Because according to Quigley, civilization goes through 7 stages. And these 7 stages are mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. Now, we've gone over in detail what these terms mean in previous episodes, so I won't be going over them again here. We're just going to be looking specifically at Canaanite civilization, which, according to Quigley, is the one that deviates the most from these 7 stages. So when we looked at Mesopotamian civilization, we saw very clearly this rise and fall from mixture to invasion of Mesopotamian civilization that had very minor distortions to it. Apparently, from all the civilizations that Quigley has studied, Canaanite civilization separates itself the most from this standard rise and fall. So, as Nima mentioned, Canaanite civilization was in the Levant, which is essentially modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. And this area was actually on the periphery of Mesopotamian civilization. In fact, Mesopotamian civilization would eventually conquer this area, which is one of the reasons why Canaanite civilization deviates so much from these 7 stages, and is also one of the reasons why Canaanite civilization can kind of be considered a child of Mesopotamian civilization. And in an earlier episode, I included a graphic from Quigley's books, and I'll include it in the show notes in this one as well, which it's sort of a civilization family tree starting from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and he's got Sinic, or early Chinese civilization, in there too, and showing how they connect to lead to the modern day civilizations, most important for this conversation being the West. So what we're going to do now is apply these principles to Canaanite civilization and see how the 7 stages stack up against it. So just before we do that, a natural question would be, why do we care about Canaanite civilization if we're going to be understanding the West? Well, Canaanite civilization and Minoan, which we'll be going over in a later episode, which took place roughly at the same time, are essentially the connection between Mesopotamian civilization and classical civilization. Again, classical is like Greeks and Romans. And classical civilization, of course, is the direct parent to Western civilization. So the dates that Quigley gives for Minoan and Canaanite civilizations are 3000 to 1000 BC for Minoan, which was in modern-day Crete, and 2250 to 50 BC for Canaanite. And so even though Minoan civilization came first and died first before Canaanite civilization, we're actually going to be looking at Canaanite first because Minoan is more of a direct ancestor to the Greeks. In fact, in some historical circles, it's actually referred to as a Proto-Greek civilization. So in terms of where that culture came from, that was a much, much closer ancestor. But Canaanite also has some very big influences into classical civilization, which of course comes to the West. So, as we mentioned, or as Quigley details, of all the civilizations that Quigley talks about, this one deviates the most from the normal 7 stages. Now, this probably has to do with the fact that this area, the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, I guess we should throw that one in there, is the crossroads for the entire Afro-Eurasian landmass. And again, when I say Afro-Eurasian landmass, I mean all of North Africa, all of Europe, all of Asia, and even India, if we're going to consider India separate from Asia. They all cross right here. And we specifically spoke about in an earlier episode as well what's called the Syrian Saddle. And that there's this one spot right next to the head of the Euphrates River, which is its closest point to the Mediterranean Sea. That because you have a huge mountain range to the north and a huge desert to the south, there's this really small part that you can cross. And particularly before modern seafaring abilities, this was the only way you can get from east to west in this entire Afro-Eurasian landmass. Well, that Syrian Saddle is right where we're talking about for Canaanite civilization. So the Egyptians were fighting over this spot, the Hittites were fighting over this spot, the Mesopotamians were fighting over this spot, and even the Minoans later would be fighting over this spot. So Quigley points out that Canaanite civilization is often missed by historians as having any sort of basic unity. Mostly because historians place emphasis on geographic areas or linguistic groupings or political units or religious groupings. But as we know from reading Quigley, the unity that we need to be looking for in civilizations is the instrument of expansion. And quick review, the instrument of expansion is the way that a civilization is able to generate surplus, save surplus, and reinvest that surplus into creating or proliferating invention, which helps to create more surplus to begin with. And the 7 stages of civilization actually have to do with the way that the civilization is interacting with that instrument of expansion, because at some point it becomes institutionalized, and the reinvestment into the society, which is usually through the invention, which raises the standards of living for everyone, makes everyone's lives better, becomes broken because a group of vested interests gain control over this instrument, and if it's instead of reinvesting it into invention, they just spend it all on themselves on lavish stuff. And going back to the historical confusion about Canaanite civilization, it also probably arises from the fact that Canaanite civilization's universal empire, stage 5 in the 7 stages, was Carthage. And that this was so distant from the Levant, because remember, Carthage is on like the west side of North Africa, like modern day Libya and Tunisia and stuff, that I guess if you're just looking at a map, it'd be hard to consider that this was the universal empire that conquered all of the civilization, if the civilization is way back over there on the other side of the sea. But Quigley mentions that the best way to imagine this would be something like, imagine for the West if the entirety of Europe were conquered, let's say by the remaining societies from Islamic civilization. I know this would be really difficult to imagine. And they came in and they invaded and destroyed Europe and took it over, and it becomes this new society. But North America, through the United States and Canada, New Zealand, and Australia all lived on, and United States emerged as the political unit that controlled them all. Well, this would be analogous to what happened in Canaanite civilization, where Western civilization would continue to exist. We would have a universal empire as the United States, even though the core of the civilization had fallen to Islamic barbarians. Like I said, I know that's totally crazy to imagine. It's not like that could ever happen, but that's an analogy of what it would be like. Man, could you imagine that happening, Nima?
No way. Not today.
No way. Not today.
Not with Merkel at the helm.
So, no way. She's keeping everything Western. Totally Western. So the instrument of expansion for Canaanite civilization is actually one that we should readily recognize because it's a form of commercial capitalism. And apparently it was similar to what the West was doing from 1440 to 1690 AD. And for the sake of this conversation and for the sake of the book, Quigley defines capitalism as an economic organization motivated by the pursuit of profit within a price structure. And when commerce becomes a central mechanism of a social system, we call this social system commercial capitalism.
Which basically means the profits are mostly derived from international trade. Merchants leaving your country, going somewhere else and trading goods and then coming back. Is that what that means?
Yeah.
As opposed to,
I think
as
so,
opposed to
because
industrial capitalism, which is about, building new factories and capital equipment to increase worker productivity.
And to have mass production.
Right.
Particularly is what comes out of industrial capitalism. Yeah, I think so. And I think the fact that I think ships are very important to this as well, because particularly at the time, the movement over water was much more efficient than movement over land. So naturally, if you had a seafaring people, which these people were, particularly in the Mediterranean or even in the Black Sea, where you have many different cultures along these shores, yeah, I would totally see that as the case. And Quigley makes the observation that because these people were right on the Syrian saddle, which is the connection between at least three different civilizations, Egyptian, Hittite, and Mesopotamian, it would naturally be a place where if you would control it, you would be the middlemen between these three different civilizations with a place to, a chance to turn a huge profit. So as we spoke about it for several episodes now, all instruments will eventually become institutions, and the most important one is this instrument of expansion. And so for a capitalist instrument of expansion, goods and services are supplied to people in order to earn a profit. And a system that does this remains as an instrument as long as people are being provided the goods and services that they need for, cheaper prices and making them more accessible. So the standards of living rise and life expectancy rises, and you have enough resources to reproduce more, and so on and so forth. Well, when it turns into an institution, goods and services are restricted to earn a profit, which and the process looks something like this, where the more capitalists trade when we're in the instrument phase, the more goods and services people get, and the cheaper those goods and services become because people are trading more and more and more, and things are becoming more available. Now, the capitalist has two options to continue earning profits while things are becoming cheaper. The obvious thing that comes to my mind is that you can lower the cost through invention in order to increase profit, because and this is kind of we're putting our industrial capitalist hat on a little bit here, but how do we invent something that generates greater worker productivity, like you just said? But the other option is we can restrict the flow of goods. We can introduce licensing and guilds and taxes and regulations and laws, or in whatever they called it back in Canaanite times, to control prices that way. Well, because you've now limited the goods and services that people are able to get, people aren't able to get as many goods and services with the same amount of income that they had before. So the standard of living is going to drop. The people's access to services is going to drop. And instrument which supplied people with the things that they need, the goods and services that they needed, starts turning more into supplying the vested interests of the ruling classes with what they need to, I don't know, continue being vested interested in ruling classes, having all the wealth to spend on whatever they want and being very egotistical and narcissistic. So one thing I want to mention, because we're on a libertarian network here, we need to talk a little quickly about capitalism and the way we're referring to it here in Canaanite civilization. And what's very important to point out is the capitalism we're talking about here does not involve the non-aggression principle in any way whatsoever. As we're going to see, and as we actually joked about at the beginning of this show, Canaanite civilization was pretty vicious and bloodthirsty. And killing or conquering your neighbor or killing or conquering your competition was just kind of a part of business. So don't shoot us any messages about what capitalism actually is. We're familiar with the non-aggression principle and free markets and stuff. In terms of this historical outlook, this is quite a different animal. Did you want to add something there, Nima?
Well, I think it's important to look at capitalism in history as it has emerged and as it has been applied, and not to some idealized version that you're imagining of capitalism. So,
and projecting it backwards. Yeah, because I mean, we could talk up and down all day about the greatness of being able to freely exchange, which of course is great, and me and Nima agree with that. But particularly as we talked about in our other shows, not the one on the evolution of civilizations, but the ones on MMT and the origins of money systems, money is not based on the idea of freely trading with people.
Yeah.
It's based on the idea of dealing with blood feuds.
Yeah, and slavery and military invasions and occupations. Those are the origins of markets, essentially.
Yeah. So, unless you got something to add, I'm going to move on to stage 1.
Move on.
Of Canaanite civilization. All right, so let's look at stage 1, which is mixture of Canaanite civilization, and quickly puts these dates between 2300 and 1300 BC. That 1300 is a very interesting timing for this. We'll get into that in a bit. So here are the potential peoples that we have mixing in this area, and it's a lot. So the Amaru people from the Syrian desert migrated both east and west. The eastern Amaru were the Amorites, which were also known as the Babylonians, which ended up being a early universal empire over in Mesopotamian civilization. And the Amaru that went west we call the Canaanites. So I guess the Babylonians and the Canaanites have a common ancestor. So these were Semitic people. They were largely pastoral, warlike, patriarchal, polytheistic, and animistic. And I guess they had deities in everything from natural objects to abstract ideas, which actually reminds me a lot of Shinto. I don't know if you know anything about
it's a
Shinto.
Japanese religion, right?
Yes, a Japanese religion where it's essentially every little thing everywhere has a spirit that you could build a shrine for and pray to. And I know a bit about Shinto because I've participated and done it for a while in my Aikido practice. But there's a line in a prayer in Shinto that talks about the 800 million gods of the universe. And it's not that there's exactly 800 million, it's that they were using a really, really, really big number to mean infinite. And I think this idea where, you know, these Amaru people are having deities and everything from natural objects to abstract ideas is probably a similar concept. Now, we also had people from Mesopotamia, Egypt, And so a people's called the Mitanni, which were apparently Indo-Europeans from the north. And we had some Minoan and Mycenaean influence from the west. Mycenaeans being the Proto-Greeks that we talked about, which were the ended up being the universal empire for the whole of Minoan civilization. So Quigley says that this mixture of people, even though they were coming from so many different varieties of backgrounds, gained a distinct outlook. And from his descriptions, I get the idea that these people were shrewd, vicious businessmen that were all about getting things done and didn't have a lot of time to spend on things like art. And there's an emphasis on bloodthirsty and violent here because, again, as Nima and I were joking at the beginning of the show, this is where the owl god Moloch comes from. So I'm guessing if you're listening to this, you've heard of Bohemian Grove, where our leaders meet every year. I don't remember what time of year that they meet. Do you? Is it sometime in spring?
Yeah, actually, I don't know.
Anyway, it's been happening for almost 100 years, where all our male political leaders meet, and in California, where they have this massive statue of an owl placed next to, I think it's a lake, and they burn a effigy of a child in front of it. And they call this...
So it seems like they first gathered on June 29th, 1878.
More than 100 years. Wow. So they burn a child effigy in front of this thing, and they call it the cremation of care. And it's incredibly creepy. Alex Jones actually busted into this and filmed it. You can go watch a film of them cremating care in front of this owl god, and there's a lot of weird stories about homosexual escorts that our wonderful politicians bring to these places. But Moloch originally, reportedly, back in Canaanite civilization, was worshipped by throwing infants on fires before it. Whoa. I don't really know what to say about it more than that. And that our political leaders think that this is such a cool idea that they need to reenact it once a year in modern day.
Yeah, it just shows you that there's very old rituals and very old cults controlling society at the highest levels to this day.
Yeah. And who knows how long people have been doing this. I mean, obviously they were doing it back in Canaanite civilization. Is there like an unbroken chain of people doing this stuff all the way up to, what was it, June 1st, 1879? I don't know. But obviously they remembered it. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
So going back to Canaanite civilization here. So the original settlers appeared to have been organized in blood familial groupings. This is in contrast to having a system of law or universal principles. So being attached to a strong family was actually a better guarantee of personal safety and rights than any sort of individual prowess or even being a noble. Quigley says even being a prince wasn't as interesting or useful as having a strong family. And so retaliatory group pressure, which, going back to blood feuds, which may have something to do with the fact that they developed such a capitalistic society, retaliatory group pressure was kind of what kept everybody in balance. Is you didn't mess with me because by messing with me, you messed with my family. Now, families started becoming more and more like states as they gained more influence and acquired more land, which eventually replaced the old ideas of tribal loyalty and blood vengeance. Now, at this point in the book, this gets fairly interesting because Quigley now brings up the Hebrews. And I have never heard this story about the Hebrews outside of this text, not that I've really gone looking for it. But I know that this history and this is the same with Christian history, and this is the same with Islamic history, is so difficult to deal with because it's so hard to pry the biblical story from historical records. Because one of the reasons I feel is you have so many religious people who are interested in these historical records who are trying to prove that the historical records are accurate, that they kind of get mushed together. You ever had this feeling, Nima? You know what I'm talking about?
No, go on.
Okay. Let me give an example before we get into the Hebrews. So I was watching. I'll find this and link it below. I forgot the professor's name. I found a YouTube video of a professor going into the history of the origins of Islam. And what he opens up in the lecture is that for a long time, even the West has taken the Quranic story of Muhammad as the historical story. So when you read even a Western textbook about what happened in 600 to 700 or even 600 to 800 AD in Saudi Arabia, you're more or less going to see the story of Muhammad. And this professor points out, if you ignore the Quran and you look for other historical evidence, there's no evidence of Muhammad in the historical record. And there's no evidence of any of the stuff that happened in Islam until roughly 800 AD. And he hypothesizes that this Arabian peoples may have been very lucky in the sense that the two neighbors that they usually acted as mercenaries for, the Romans and the Persians, just got done having a huge war where they both essentially knocked each other out. And the Arabs had experience being mercenaries for both armies, and they were able to explode in military conquest because they had the experience and their neighbors were weak. And it may have been that 200 years later they had to come up with a story that explained and justified what they had been doing for the last 200 years. And this, of course, it will be absolutely sacrilegious to any Muslim hearing it. You were going to say something?
Well, no, I was thinking something, but I wasn't going to say something.
Okay.
I was just thinking totally not haram, but it's okay.
Wait, I thought it is haram. Isn't haram sin?
Oh, maybe it's haram. It's some damn haram thing.
You're the worst Iranian ever.
True that.
I don't know if you took that as a compliment or not. That wasn't racist.
I do.
That just to let everybody know, that wasn't racist. It was Islamophobic. So, the reason I brought that up, going back to the Hebrews, is now when you hear about the history of the Hebrews, whatever I've read about it, people will the writer will bring up what's written in the Bible in the Old Testament, and will kind of weave in and out of the historical evidence and the story in the Old Testament, kind of like they're both valid. And I've always scratched my head going, okay, how much are you putting on just taking that story for granted, and how much are we digging up through historical evidence? So I don't know how much Quigley is doing from one or the other in the story that I'm about to describe. However, I do find it to be very fascinating because I've never heard this origin story for the Hebrews. The Hebrews being one of the core societies within Canaanite civilization. So it goes like this. So throughout Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant, there were scattered persons that for one reason or another had lost their family support. And we just emphasize, particularly in the Canaanite area, why family support was so important. Because it was essentially your physical safety was on the line. These people were called the Habiru. and they sought the favor of Yahweh, the God of mercy, a lesser Canaanite deity. It's worth mentioning that the Habiru, at least at this point, they were not monotheistic. Many were metal and music makers, and Quigley states that they started as a legal or social group. I guess this group of people who didn't have any family protection, and they focused on this God of mercy, Yahweh. Then they became a religious group at the time of Moses. Then they became a political group at the time of Joshua. And then when the Assyrians destroyed the Hebrew state, they became a religious group again, but would often try to become a political group by enforcing Hebrew law, or a biological group through endogamy, which I guess is making sure you don't breed with outsiders.
So what was the Hebrew state? What was it called? Was it just the Hebrew state?
I think if you go by the Bible, there was actually two Hebrew states. There was Judea and there was Israel.
Okay.
I think Judea was in the south and Israel was in the north. And again, I don't know how much of this is historical and how much of this is coming from the Old Testament. But whatever the case, Quigley points out that the Hebrews were always members of Canaanite civilization and were never their own individual society. So this leads us to stage 2, which is gestation. And
well, also, just to add to that, I just came across a meme that says, there is no country called Israel or Palestine. There's only Canaan, which is currently occupied by an army of international thieves and murderers.
Well, I think that's the story of Canaan. if we're to go by, what I just read.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see that people are still
fighting over that,
being supportive of Canaan. So they seem to have a good lobby even nowadays.
Yeah, well, let's bring back Moloch.
In meme land. At least in meme land.
At least at meme land. Funny. Okay, stage 2, gestation. So Quigley points out, normally we have dates ascribed to all these stages. Quigley says that the mixture is so muddled that we can't really ascribe any specific dates to gestation. And he says there was probably a series of advances and relapses as people were moving in and getting conquered out. But he points out that around 1300 BC, Egyptian and Hittite civilizations lost control of the region because they were getting pummeled by Iron Age invaders. And apparently Hittite civilization didn't survive this. It is the one civilization that Quigley describes that doesn't do the 7 stages. It actually gets killed in its stage 3 or stage 4 by Iron Age invaders. And the one thing I wanted to bring up here is the collapse of 1186 BC, or I've also heard the dates 1177 BC. We'll call it roughly 1200 BC, where there's a pretty big discussion in modern historical circles, and I know this because I've been watching videos on YouTube. I think that makes me a member of the club of modern historical circles. But that there was a huge collapse of what they have termed civilization in approximately 1186 BC, and there's a big discussion today as to what caused it. Now, when they're saying civilization, they're meaning Mesopotamia, Hittite, Minoan, Egyptian, and everything that was happening in the Levant, which was the crossroads between all these places. All of that has the bottom fall out from underneath it, and people point to droughts. They point to earthquakes. I think there was mention of a volcano. They point to pestilence, and they point to invasions from the Sea Peoples, which I believe were Iron Age invaders, and were actually the Philistines, or people think that they were the Philistines. That the Israelites were constantly fighting with in the Old Testament. And when people look at the archaeological record, there's evidence of a huge flourishing trade that was happening that just suddenly stops. Now, and also this is known as the end of the Bronze Age, because this is when the Iron Age invaders come in. While this is considered to be an end of civilization for modern historians, I find it interesting that when we look at Quigley's definition of civilization, which is a society that has its own instrument of expansion, we see that, so Hittite civilization ends at this time, like I just mentioned. If you were comparing the dates that I said at the beginning, Minoan civilization pretty much ends at this time. However, Egyptian civilization and Mesopotamian civilization do not get ended from whatever this catastrophe was. And in fact, Canaanite civilization seems to take this as the opportunity to explode into its age of expansion. And this makes me recall back to what Quigley brings up at the beginning of the book, which is, why does a civilization which has been responding to challenges successfully for centuries gradually cease to do so and decays? And in this catastrophe of the ancient world of 1186 or 1177 or whatever exact date it was, BC, we see two civilizations that die, two that hold on for another 850 years, and one that begins to grow all in the same area. And I think the results of this event actually really embolden Quigley's ideas here, because as we discussed in previous episodes, in talk of history, no one is ever really able to give a good definition of civilization. You can see that it's there, right? I mean, you see pyramids and hanging gardens and colosseums and Hagia Sophias and huge cities, and you're like, okay, obviously there's something here that we could call civilization, but no one can exactly describe what the thing is that makes it civilization and what not. And Quigley here has done it, as far as I'm able to agree with him and the evidence that he puts forth, because this catastrophic event, which happened at 1186 BC, didn't destroy the civilizations, as most historians point out. I mean, I'm sure even for the civilizations that survived, for example, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian, I'm sure things were really bad for a while. But the fact that the instrument of expansion wasn't destroyed and it allowed these people to come back, versus the Minoans and the Hittites, which were not, and versus the Canaanites, which used it as an opportunity to say, like, oh, hey, look, all the international pressures off of us, we can grow. I think it's pretty cool that it gives us a much better working understanding of what's possible, and how and really how a people could deal with problems or deal with challenges that are facing the entire civilization. So this actually leads us into stage 3, which is expansion of Canaanite civilization. So as we just mentioned, Egyptian civilization and Hittite civilization kind of withdraw at this time, probably largely from the cataclysmic events, the invasions from the Sea Peoples, and the fact that these two civilizations were probably in their own age of conflict at the time anyway. This allowed the Canaanite new commercial society to emerge. And we see 3 pressures on the area happening at that time. So the Canaanite pagans in the southern Levant were being squeezed by the Philistines coming from the sea. These were the Sea Peoples. And so those are the first 2 pressures. And the Hebrews coming from the desert to the east. So this earthquake that we talked about, which Quigley point at 1365 BC, and I know these dates are constantly getting updated as better dating methods are developed. So I don't know what date modern historians are putting that big earthquake at. It took out many northern seaports. So southern seaports like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre gained prominence, and these were the early Phoenician cities. And these are the cities that are going to take Canaanite commerce through the age of expansion. Now, I actually wanted to take a second here, or maybe a minute, because Nima has been taking some time to research climate stuff and the story of climate change, because we just looked at right now a shift in climate that happened, 3,000 years ago, that was civilization destroying for some, but even if it wasn't civilization destroying for the civilization that certain people were in, it was still quite devastating. And it's interesting to see that the environmental movement of today takes these disasters, which obviously the people at the time, 3,000 years ago, couldn't have been the cause of, and places them squarely on the shoulders of humans. And of course...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that is quite interesting, isn't it? That we've had all these environmental shifts and giant climate changes, ice ages,
comets,
entire civilizations being eradicated or moving because of ice ages, etc. And today, some people believe a fundamentalist doomsday cultist story that says that humans breathing and driving SUVs is the cause of all of that, without any scientific evidence for it. In fact, with a bunch of scientific evidence against it.
Well, now we know that scientists agree, so therefore it's true.
Right. I mean, that is a trope that you don't read in scientific research papers. You hear that in Hollywood movies and in the corporate media all the time. So the people who don't spend the time on reading science papers, but watching the Colbert Report or, whatever, the Tonight Show or the Daily
Whatever's
Show.
Popular today.
Or some doomsday Hollywood movie, the 2 days before the day after tomorrow, or whatever it's called. They just parrot these tropes, like 97% of scientists agree, and think that they've achieved a major scientific feat. And it's not how it works.
And not only is it not how it works, if we look at the evidence here, that this environmental movement, the one that really places the blame on humans, came roughly out of the 70s. And it was actually, there's a group of people, they've got a website. It's not so secret like the Bohemian Grove. The Club of Rome is a group that it's a roundtable group that Al Gore was a member of.
They're more just a roundtable group. They're a high-level steering committee for the United Nations, essentially.
Well, there you go. And in the 70s, they wrote a book called Limits to Growth. And I never read the book myself. I've only read excerpts from it. So if someone wants to come by and say, no, I've taken this out of context, please let me know. But the famous quote from the book is paraphrased something like this, which is that we being the Club of Rome, were searching for something that could unite humanity, and we decided on the subject of pollution. And because humans create pollution, what this means is that human beings become the enemy. Human beings become their own enemy. So the whole idea was to give humans a reason to despise their own existence, because pollution, every living organism creates some sort of pollution, and you have to deal with the fact that you create this pollution, that your very existence is pollution. And they took this one step further by going with CO2 being that pollution. CO2, of course, being one of the elements of life, like it's plant food. And we exhale it, plants take it, turn it into food that we can eat, that we later exhale, or we die and we break down and we turn back into CO2, and that's how the cycle of life works. So
well, that's a lot of people think that all these climate conferences and all this legislation that is being shoved down the throats of the different people in different countries in the world, people think that that is fighting pollution, but they don't see that it's actually just fighting
anti-human
CO2. Yeah, which is a life-giving substance, and it's a substance associated with, organic life and with humans and with growth. So it is such a sleazy trick to sneak in austerity through the back door. Whereas, people on the left usually understand that austerity is murder, is basically, slowly killing off the population. And they totally don't see that when it comes to the type of austerity that these climate doomsday cultists will impose on the world once all is said and done. And they're already on the way. They're already on the path of doing that. Yeah.
Well, look what's. I mean, I guess it's coincidental that we're talking about this right now. Look what's happening in Europe, particularly France. I know it's expanded to beyond CO2 taxes, but
it was fuel taxes.
Yeah, but by raising these fuel taxes, and it was raised like a quarter of a euro or something, but the plan was to keep raising it that much every year.
Yeah,
huge.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And I mean, when hundreds of millions of people on the face of this planet survive due to the fact that we're able to create so much stuff using the chemical energy stored in hydrocarbons and oil, that if you were to suddenly take that away, like Nima just mentioned, you are just imposing austerity. You're just taking away the ability of these people to live. And I don't mean make a living live. I mean literally have something to eat live.
Yeah. And people always say, well, but Green New Deal and new energy. Well, new energy, then we're not opposed to that. But let people develop new energy solutions that are more effective and efficient, and then they will replace those things. I have my doubts on that. A lot of experts do too.
I have my doubts as well, but I completely agree. Go for it.
I have even more doubts if you're trying to force this replacement on everyone through the guns of the state and through legislation. You're kind of losing the argument right there. So it's a dangerous religious doomsday cult, in my opinion, of attention-seeking, preening amateurs who parrot corporate media lies and Hollywood fiction, while studiously avoiding any and all peer-reviewed science on the matter. And they lecture you about science and how you are bad for driving big cars and having children and acting like they're saving the world, while being incredibly useful idiots, right? In an agenda of worldwide austerity of the most destructive and murderous kind. Ugh.
Yeah,
what a
it's awful.
Sick, disgusting bunch of freaks.
Yeah. Yeah. And what gets me I don't know if it gets me the most. It's up there. What gets me a lot is that, so I majored in chemistry. And I worked at an oil refinery. I was a laboratory technician in an oil refinery. And I got to see everything that was going into making the gas and making the diesel and making the propane and all these different things. And there's a lot of nasty stuff in oil. Don't get me wrong. I remember the older chemists telling me stories that when they, back in the 70s, they were getting oil from Indonesia, that there was mercury in the oil, and then after they refined a bunch of it through the crude tower, there was a massive layer of mercury at the bottom of the crude tower, and they apparently gave it to the paper mill downtown, and the paper mill dumped it into the ocean. And I'm like, holy fuck.
Yeah, there's
bad, man. Don't dump mercury into the ocean. Mercury's a real environmental toxin. CO2 is not.
There's so much bad stuff around us everywhere being done by corporations, allowed by governments, and being put in our foods and our water supply, sprayed in the air. It's all over the place.
And these people have the audacity to say CO2 is the problem. Your breathing gas is the problem. Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's disgusting. So,
and I think the people who do parrot this nonsense, who parrot this cultist doomsday fiction, they need to be called out, embarrassed, shamed, and ridiculed every time they try to open their loud mouths. And they belong to some lunatic fundamentalist amateur fringe. And not into, they're not some sort of mainstream.
They're not the main group. They're not Bill Nye saving the world. Goddamn, Bill Nye. You're so much more of a dick than I thought you were when I was young watching your show. Unless you still got more ranting energy in you about that. One thing I think that people who are into this environmentalist cult should do to prove their belief in their words is they should crunch up fluorescent light bulbs and snort them in celebration of the energy that they're saving, because the fluorescent light bulbs are so green for the environment. Prove it. Put some of it in your body. It's mercury salts. I get so shocked that people don't know this. Do you know that fluorescent light bulbs, for you to dispose of them, it's hazmat. If you break a fluorescent light bulb, in a commercial sense, if you break a fluorescent light bulb, you're supposed to bring in a hazmat team in spacesuits.
I mean, it's
that nasty.
And there's fluoride again, I guess, right? I mean, what's up with these people putting fluoride everywhere, which is a byproduct of the aluminum industry, I believe.
Yeah. So I'll take out my chemistry hat again. Fluoride is a byproduct of the aluminum and steel industries because fluo in fluorine means to flow, and originally, hundreds of years ago, people discovered fluorite rocks, like calcium fluorite. When they put them into their smelting, like if they're smelting iron, it lowered the temperature required to smelt the ore. Well, this is what they do today, particularly with aluminum. When I worked at the refinery, there's actually an aluminum smelter just up north of me, or where I was working. They aluminum smelters take roughly 1% of the energy consumption of the entire nation. Just aluminum. Because they need so much power to heat up the aluminum hot enough where it will smelt the ore at something like 900 degrees Celsius, or I can't remember if it was Celsius or Fahrenheit, but it's hot. And aluminum smelting is literally the biggest energy requirement of a single industry there is, period. And so anything that you could do to lower the temperature requirement to get that stuff smelted is obviously something that you want to do. And so for aluminum, they use cryolite, which is an aluminum ore that contains fluorine or fluoride, and they put that into the aluminum. Now, anyone who knows the history of fluorine knows that it is the most electronegative element in the universe, meaning it is the most reactive element that there is. If you look at a chart on the periodic table of elements of electronegativity, fluorine has the top rating. And it was one of the last elements to be discovered when chemists were trying to discover all the elements. And I'm not including like the heavy after uranium metals that they're still discovering. Fluorine was one of the last ones because it's so violently reactive, they couldn't get it to unreact with something to isolate it. And when they did, and I think they did originally by putting sulfuric acid on calcium fluorite, it's a pretty rock, that as soon as it came out as a gas, it would immediately react with anything, including the air. And so the only way to isolate fluorine is to have something that has a that's already reacted with fluorine, like Teflon. Teflon is a fluorocarbon compound, and nothing sticks to it because it's already reacted with fluorine, and nothing theoretically can knock that fluorine off in order to react with the carbon. And then you have to, in order to extract this, you have to get all the air out and make it a vacuum. So when you put the fluorine in, it can't react with the air, and it can't react with the walls of the container because it is that wickedly reactive. All the original people back in the I think this is the late 1800s, and what's his name? Famous sci-fi writer, Russian name, wrote the Foundation series. Why can't I think of his name? Come on, Nima. Be my wingman. Damn it. It'll come to me.
Asimov?
Thank you. Yes. Isaac Asimov. It was Asimov. He wrote a book on various histories of chemistry, and he actually wrote a article on the history of fluorine, that all the fluorine became synonymous with poison because everybody who tried to study it died. And fluoride, which is the salt that you get from reacting fluorine, it loses its chemical fury. It's not going to like melt your face off. It wreaks havoc on your biological system, particularly through your thyroid, because your thyroid produces goddamn fucking words going out of my head again. Hormones. Woo! Your thyroid produces hormones largely using iodine. So there's more chemically accurate, iodide. So the negative ion that you usually find in salts, the iodide. There's iodide receptors in your thyroid that pick up the iodide, so it could use it to create these hormones. Iodine has a similar valence structure to fluoride because they're on the same column in the periodic table, and your thyroid iodide receptors will actually pick up these fluoride atoms, and it will cause havoc to your thyroid. And it also does awful things to the rest of your body. For example, it screws up your bone structure because it reacts with calcium. In fact, oh my God, here's a refinery story for you. One of the units mainly in a refinery is called an alkylation unit, which takes a propene or a butene molecule and fuses them together in order to make isoheptane and isooctane, which is a very good octane gasoline component in the mixture of gasoline. There's two ways to use a catalyst to do this. You could use sulfuric acid or you could use hydrofluoric acid. The refinery I worked at used hydrofluoric acid, which it's a strong acid and it'll burn you, but that's less interesting than the fact that it will actually react with the calcium in your blood. And the rule of thumb is if you get a splash of hydrofluoric acid on you the size of a fist, anywhere in your body, you're dead. You're dead. Smaller than that, they have to amputate. That shit scared the shit out of me when I worked there. Let me tell you what. Whew. And I know we're really getting off topic here, but I really want to bust in how nasty fluorine is to everybody. Hydrofluoric acid, when it gets exposed to atmosphere, actually goes psst, and it forms into a gas and floats around as a cloud. So unlike sulfuric acid, which will burn the shit out of you, which will drip onto the ground, hydrofluoric acid will actually float around in the air, and if you didn't recognize what it was, you could actually find yourself in a cloud of hydrofluoric acid. So, yay fluoride. Right. That's the stuff that's getting put into the water.
But CO2, bro.
It's medicine. Yeah, CO2. Now, that's a chemical right there. CO2. So, we were talking about Canaanite civilization. You remember that?
Oh, right. We're talking about history, not chemistry.
Oh, yeah. History. History of fluoride. History of fluorine. Okay, so that rant was instigated by the earthquake of 1365 BC, which destroyed a lot of the surrounding area. So we were simply comparing that natural disasters could really have a massive effect on these civilizations and societies. They could really do a lot of damage and really change the face of what's going on. And for the Canaanite civilization, this appears to be a boon because it took out the Hittites and it took out the Egyptians, which allowed them to go forward and procreate. So we were talking about the age of expansion, and Quigley comes back to the Hebrews here, which is, again, we're getting back into this Old Testament story. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but Quigley talks about Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt around 1300 BC, and that these Jews, instead of staying close to the coast of the Mediterranean, as they went through the Sinai Peninsula, they went out around into the desert. I guess this is what the Bible talks about, where they were fed with manna for 40 years, running around in the desert, and came around from the eastern side of Palestine, essentially, Canaan, to attack from the east. And apparently they were able to sack the city of Jericho around 1230 BC, but they were unable to press westward because the Canaanites were able to fight them off. Well, the lime-plastered cistern was invented around this time, which allowed the catching of rainwater, which allowed these Israelites to settle into these eastern hills, because remember, this is a pretty hot spot. And eventually, the Canaanites were absorbed between the Habiru, these Hebrews, from the east, and the Philistines, the sea peoples invading from the west. And however, Quigley points out that the Canaanite culture was not that greatly changed, and particularly that the main differences between the Canaanites and the Hebrews were religious ones. And I mean, you can even read this in the Old Testament, that the Hebrews were regularly falling back into polytheistic acts, even though Moses was the one that came out and started preaching the monotheism of Yahweh. Quigley also points out that the age of the biggest change at this time was actually probably the introduction of iron tools and iron weapons. He thinks they came from the Hebrews, or he says they came from the Hebrews, but I feel like they may have come from the Sea Peoples as well, because I think they were known as Iron Age invaders. So you had these original Canaanites who were a Bronze Age civilization that get pinched from both sides with Iron Age invaders. However, throughout all of this, with these different people, with these different religions, the instrument of expansion continues to be this commercial capitalism that we already described. So by the turn of the millennium, the Hebrews had built up two kingdoms on the east, Judah to the north and Israel to the south. I had them backwards earlier. I said Judah to the south and Israel to the north. So in the west, controlling the coast, the southern sections was in the hands of the Canaanites, and the northern section was in the hands of the Phoenicians. Thus, it looks like that everybody within this Canaanite civilization got to act as middlemen. So the Phoenicians and the Canaanites controlled the goods coming from the Mediterranean Sea, and the Hebrews got to act as this buffer between the sea and the rest of Arabia and Mesopotamia. So it's no wonder why commerce was such a big deal there. Now, under the reign of David and Solomon, which apparently is 1010 to 930 BC, the Hebrews were able to finance massive architecture and temples due to the surplus being generated as middlemen between the Arabs of the Red Sea and the Canaanites of the Phoenician coast. These, of course, being examples of the age of expansion, of things really growing and the standards of living rising for everybody. And by 1000 BC, the Phoenicians began to colonize the Mediterranean. And I got a map that I'll include from Wikipedia, so you could really see how far that the Phoenicians went. They even extend to the western side of Spain, on the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar, which I knew in ancient times was terrifying for people to go to because the Atlantic Ocean was so much more dangerous than the Mediterranean Sea. And colonies were placed in Carthage, Sardinia, Malaga, and Cadiz. Malaga and Cadiz being in Spain. So the first signs of institutionalization and conflict, again, I don't know if he's just taking this straight from the Bible or if there's any historical evidence to this, but at least according to the story of the Bible, the Hebrews transitioned from an age of judges to an age of kings, where in the age of judges, everybody kind of took care of themselves, and if they had any conflict, they had a judge that was essentially the high priest of the society that they would go to, work out their legal issues, I guess one could say it. And I guess the judge's job was to do it according to Hebrew law and Hebrew religion and tradition. Well, at some point, the people started demanding kings, again, according to the Old Testament, and God said, well, you don't want that. And they said, yes, we do. And he said, no, you don't. And they said, yes, we do. And he said, all right, well, this is what you're going to get when you get a king. So he's going to take all your daughters, and he's going to take, for his concubines, and he's going to take all his sons for his military so he can start invading your neighbors, which is age of conflict stuff right there. So despite God's best efforts, the Hebrews elect themselves a king, and the society becomes a more distinct political unit, with emphasis moving from its religious aspects to its military aspects. And one of the signs of the age of expansion was kind of a presence of democratic traits. Now, of course, this isn't democratic in any of the sense that we would consider it today, but the idea that different families had more or less different, or more or less the same political leverage, because they would have to go to this judge in order to work out their differences. Compare that to now we have a king and we just have to do whatever he says. Obviously, we're moving from more democracy to less democracy. So, a couple other reminders of an age of expansion, because we're going to be moving into the age of conflict here. So we see geographic extension of a society's culture is one, increase of the population, increase in economic production, growth in factual knowledge and invention, and increase in science and democracy. So from what we've seen so far, Canaanite civilization stacks up pretty well against this, particularly from the Phoenician and Canaanite extensions all over the Mediterranean. Obviously, that includes an increase in population. The Hebrews are able to make these lavish cities due to their profit from being middlemen. And I guess at least scientifically speaking, we get this lime-plastered cistern. But the big one, actually, I think there's two big ones. Let's start with the first big one I got here, is money. So we've talked a little bit about money on this show. And the history of money places the first metallic money at roughly, what was it, 800 BC?
In Lydia, I believe.
In Lydia. Well, I don't know if Lydia was a Phoenician.
I believe it was Greek.
Colony or not?
Greek.
But I know okay, but I think weren't the Phoenicians famous for really expanding the use of metallic money?
Sure. Yeah. Definitely.
I think they were, and as we've also pointed out in previous episodes, the pervasiveness of metallic money, or the greater use of metallic money, actually turned into a case of universal warfare. And having our age of conflict starting right around this time that we start seeing the development of this metallic money, I think is an interesting point. The other big one, and this might be one of the biggest ones that we get from Canaanite civilization, is that the Phoenicians were the first people to develop the phonetic alphabet, which is to say letters that represent sounds as opposed to ideas. And so they had a 24-letter phonetic alphabet for writing that they probably got from the Egyptians, because they had a 24-letter alphabet, but they didn't seem to use it that much because they preferred their hieroglyphics. The Phoenicians were the first ones to really proliferate that. And I mean, I guess it makes sense, because if you're really into trade, you have to have a way of easily keeping records for everybody. And if you need more people to learn how to read, or at least make it easier for your upper classes to learn how to read, a phonetic alphabet is always easier than something that's pictographic.
By the way, Alan Watt also talks a lot about the Phoenicians from time to time, and how they introduced monetary systems into areas that didn't have a monetary system before, and imposed a tax, or put them into sort of like the ancient equivalent of bank debts, and required payments in gold coins or silver coins, or whatever other money they imposed. But I guess since that was the axial age, it was a time of metallic money for the most part, or to a larger part at least, than previous eras.
Yeah. Well, and then the Phoenicians were around before 800 BC too, so maybe they started with the banknotes. Or I mean, they didn't actually have banks, but I mean, I'm sure that the bigger merchants essentially could act as a bank, and they probably had a lot of power up, because I'm sure all these merchants had their own militaries at their own disposal. So yeah, I think they probably did this, and this is probably one of the ways they garnered a lot of slaves, because debt slavery, it was a really, 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 really big thing at this time. If you couldn't pay your debt, you and your family went into slavery. Daughters could be sold off as sex slaves, and you're rowing a boat for the rest of the 5 years of your life. So, going into conflict. So, Quigley says the age of expansion starts to show decline around 800 BC. Again, that's our axial age alert. But in the Levant, but not until about 100 years or so later in the Mediterranean. So, apparently there was growing social unrest in Palestine, which seems to be a long-held tradition passed down in that area. There was a renewed split between the two Hebrew kingdoms, and there was actually a growth in religious animosity, which could have been possibly due to the survival of Canaanite fertility ideas, and which were the original peoples that were squished together by the Philistines and the Hebrews. And the Phoenician influence exercised through people like Queen Jezebel, who story tells was a person that attempted to get the Hebrews to worship the Phoenician deity Baal, or Baal. I have no idea how to pronounce that correctly. He's just a Diablo 2 boss, in my experience. Thank you for laughing instead of groaning.
I was actually rolling my eyes.
So there were... Yeah, okay, great. So there was some renewed Egyptian invasion, some increased Aramaean pressure, and of course the savage assaults from the Assyrians, who would actually end up conquering the core area of the Levant. So the northern kingdom of Palestine was destroyed in 722 BC. This was the kingdom of Samaria, and where we get the story, the Good Samaritan. And the southern one was destroyed in 586 BC. This is by the Assyrians. However, they left the city of Tyre, Tyre, which was an island about a half mile off the coastline, and that managed to survive as a maritime commerce center until Alexander the Great smashed it in 332 BC. So we mentioned this at the beginning, that Canaanite civilization is difficult to understand historically speaking, because the core empire gets lost and destroyed. The Assyrians take it over, and then in 332, Alexander the Great just ends it. So, however, Carthage continues to exist on the western side of the Mediterranean, and quickly points out that the age of conflict was actually pretty short, probably lasting a little more than a century. And sorry, pausing and looking through my notes here. I have some interesting points about this loss of the core area of the civilization. So, one of the other things that popped back to me while I was reading through this chapter was from the beginning of this book, Evolution of Civilizations, is that Quigley starts the book by telling a story about how he looked for quartz crystals when he was a child, and that he could never seem to find a crystal that looked the way that he saw in his textbooks, and that he figured out later in his life that what the textbooks meant when they showed you these perfect quartz crystals and they said this is the way that quartz grows and forms itself, is that what they should be saying is this is the way quartz forms itself unless outside forces act upon it and shape them differently. And it seems that within the scope of the way that the universe works, that almost always happens, and the same thing applies to civilizations, and that Canaanite civilization is one that, I mean, it really has a lot of outside forces working on it, I mean, specifically from other civilizations. And the second thing that stood out to me is how do we even know that Carthage could be considered a part of Canaanite civilization? Excuse me, not the thing that stood out to me. This is one of the things that Quigley emphasized. Because when we're looking at the history of this area, Quigley pointed out that people typically fail to see a unity of the civilization that was occurring in this area. And so I think a natural reaction can be, you could say, how can you consider that Carthage was part of this Canaanite civilization? So Quigley points out that they spoke a Canaanite tongue, even though it's usually referred to by its Latin name, which is Punic. Their organization of expansion was commercial capitalism, which we went over thoroughly. And I think that the biggest one is that the religion was clearly Canaanite, as it was, in quote, full of bloodthirsty superstitions, concerned with various Baals, especially Moloch, which, as we described at the beginning, was worshipped by throwing infants into fires before it. And one of the things that really comes out to me when we talk about this Moloch and these horrible bloodthirsty superstitions that these Canaanites have is I used to do this, and I still hear this today, is a lot of people criticize Christianity by looking at the Old Testament and they go, look, Yahweh was a mean ass killing motherfucker that had his people go and slaughter cities, sometimes slaughter everybody, including the animals. Sometimes they take the animals and they take the women, and God is very specific on what you should do to which city. And you say, okay, look at how horrible the basis of this was. Well, I mean, if you compare it to what the people there were doing in the first place, I mean, it's hard to argue that it wasn't an improvement. If you've got a society there that worships their gods by throwing children or infants on fires before it, having a god that forbids you from eating shellfish isn't so bad in comparison. Were you about to tune in something there, Nima? I heard a breath in, like there was a thought that was going to be
Well,
expressed.
I don't eat shellfish, so but I wasn't gonna say anything more.
Do you wear a yarmulke?
I do not. I do not.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that shellfish aren't that great for you anyway, but god damn are they tasty.
Definitely.
Shellfish are delicious.
For me, it's yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to extract from that. So I mean, we're looking at this age of universal empire, and showing why the Carthaginians can be considered the universal empire of Canaanite civilization, and why we could still view this area as a unique civilization, despite the fact it's so distorted from what Carol Quigley describes as these 7 stages of civilization. And I specifically compared it to the quartz crystal, which is going to grow a certain way unless it has these outside forces. Well, Canaanite civilization grew a certain way, and it had a lot of different outside forces. And I wanted to bring up the thing about the Bible in the Old Testament, because I guess I meant to say this as a conclusion, but I'll say it here now anyway, is that it's easy to forget that, you know, this bizarre history of this area, which includes the Hebrews and the Israelites, whether this is historically accurate or whether this is repeating stuff from the Old Testament, is the basis on which Western civilization draws its religious and intellectual background. And I made the comparison that even though the Old Testament is full of all this horrifying bad stuff from that was directly ordered from God, it was very clearly an improvement from any sort of universal standards when we compare throwing infants on the fires of Moloch. In a very similar way, that Christianity was an improvement to the practices of what was going on in the Roman Empire. What was this? 1,300 years later, 2,000 years later, which of course, Christianity is what became the religion of Western civilization. So it's like there's these multiple iterations of how do we become more civilized, that we could draw back all the way to this really awful time to be alive in history in Canaanite civilization, because things were so awful and bloody. I mean, if you weren't burning your kids on the fires of Moloch, you were getting invaded by the Assyrians, who were probably going to flay you alive and build a pillar out of your skins. So we should probably start wrapping this up, because we're getting into it. We're at the hour and a half range. Look what our rants did, Nima. We probably ranted for a half hour in there.
Yeah. I don't know how we got to talk about fluoride, but good times.
It was good times. I'm glad I got that off my chest. I've been wanting to get that off my chest for a while. So let's kill off Canaanite civilization. You cool with that? Let's just kill it and be done with it. So stages 6 and 7, decay and invasion. By 480 BC, we start seeing clear decay by means of severe military defeats. In the east, the Phoenicians in the service of Persia were defeated by the Greeks at the Salamis, I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. In the west, the Carthaginian forces were destroyed at Himera in Sicily by Western Greeks. And apparently there's even a folktale that both of these defeats happened at the same day. But I guess they definitely happened in the same year. So this is the clear evidence that we're looking for, that Canaanite culture was smashing into the burgeoning Greek culture, which was in the full age of expansion. And as we discussed before, a civilization that's in an age of expansion will always run over a civilization that's in an age of decay. So the two death blows to Canaanite civilization, I'll mention this before. In the east, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great destroys Tyre. And in the west, the Romans sack Carthage in the Third Punic War at 146 BC. And to quote Quigley, by the time of Christ, only a few remnants of this strange, distorted civilization still survived. You like that strange, distorted civilization part? It's fucking weird, dude. Throwing infants on the fires of Moloch. I don't know how many times do I have to say this. That's weird, bad, nasty, and every other thing. Who thought of that? I know what we should do with our son. Holy shit. Wow.
Well, it's just, if you look at it big picture, there's always been an element of population control.
You're right.
That, these superstitious cults impose on the people for various reasons. Today, it's the climate doomsday freakout cult and the population control talking points that are openly parroted by big, foundations and big corporate executives and politicians. And back then, it was just, let's throw some babies into the fire.
Gotta love you. Throw that baby in the
China,
fire.
it's, one-child policy in China, where if a mom that has too many kids and who's pregnant gets dragged out of the home.
And
so we've always had that element. Well, of course.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, communism.
Jesus. God forbid you have another child.
Yeah, right? That would destroy the planet. So, I'm looking at my notes here. I think I hit most of this, which is I think it's it's important to look at Canaanite civilization because we get the roots of monotheism here from the Hebrews. We get some sort of vague resemblance to natural law, which is God's law through the Hebrews. Not that it's scientific in any sense, but it was this attempt to say, okay, there's this universal deity that controls everything, and we need to figure out what it's doing. That's somewhat of a scientific improvement over there's spirits and everything, and if they contradict each other, that's fine. And as I mentioned, this, of course, would later extend into the Roman Empire in the form of Christianity. This attempt to civilize a very brutal and vicious people and apply universal principles. So, and we also get the major gift from the Canaanites, which is the phonetic alphabet. I would like to thank them for that. I would really, really hate having to read Chinese or Egyptian hieroglyphs. I actually really like the English language. I know a lot of people criticize it, but I think it's great. We actually had a small discussion about this on a little Facebook chat.
Yeah.
But what's your favorite language that you speak?
Oh, man.
You got three, right? Farsi, German, and English?
Yeah, Persian, German, English. I don't know if I have a favorite per se. I think English is very conducive to being concise. And, back in high school... No, German is because back in high school, we read a couple of scientific chemistry papers in English, and in some cases we had the English and the German version. I always noticed the English version was much shorter. I would say maybe. Oh,
I see what you mean.
75% of the German.
I know exactly what you're talking about. German. We have a couple in English. Ways of shortening sentences that you can't do in German. And German likes those words that are 48 letters long.
Yeah, what was it? Like recently, the longest German word was abolished or something.
Yeah. Yes, I think. Did you post it? I think somebody else posted that. I don't. You have to say it.
Yeah, it's Donau-Dampf. Sorry, it's Donau-Dampf-Schifffahrts-Elektrizitäts- Hauptbetriebswerk-Bau unter Beamtengesellschaft.
As Mark Twain put it, these are not words. These are processions marching across the page. You can see all their military fanfares. They're like blowing their bugles and like throwing their batons and shit as they walk across the page.
Just a bunch of syllables assaulting you, exactly.
Okay, so... Nima, unless you got some other point you want to end here, I think we covered Canaanite civilization fairly well. We're going to be going into Minoan civilization in the next episode in this mini-series. And Did you have anything else?
Take it away.
All right, let's take it away. So we saw how even though a civilization that doesn't follow the 7 stages exactly can still be understood through Quigley's idea of the instrument of expansion, which makes it such a cool way of understanding history and understanding the modern world. So with that, this is Amagi being hosted on the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, with me, your co-host Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour, the other co-host of economicsjunkie.com. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.